So let's look now at the time map and rather time graph of the net burden of health inequity in women in a very similar way as we have done previously in men. We see that in 1961 to 1965, our first period of analysis, we see that the countries that had more than 1.5 million deaths in women in excess of the best feasible level of health, the health replicable and sustainable model, Sri Lanka, was China and India, each of them with India with over 3 million deaths and China 3.8 million. You remember that in the net burden of health inequity, the difference was much higher. It was almost twice the level of net burden of health inequity totally in China than in India in 1961. But here they're closer, 3.8 million, having at that time a much larger population, China. These are followed by Nigeria with the third largest, close to 2 million, and then other countries had lower levels, like Indonesia, like Pakistan, countries with the largest population sizes, Brazil and Mexico. And let's look at countries like South Africa, DRC. So let's see what happened with these countries as time evolves. We see how in the early 70s, in less than a decade, the number in China is reduced to less than 1 million, so 4 times less in 2 decades. India continues to have quite high levels, Nigeria as well, followed by these largely populated countries, Pakistan, Indonesia, South Africa, DRC, and with high levels of mortality. Also Brazil at that time, around 100,000. This is how it continues to be. India always with a very high mortality, over 2 million deaths all along, 2.5 million. Nigeria increasing to get closer to that level, and China much lower, while other countries also remain quite stable, with the increase in the 90s of South Africa and the Russian Federation as well, which increases to almost 700,000, then around 500,000. So this is how the net burden of health inequity looks for women in time, and this is in greater level. The countries with highest net burden of health inequity, excess mortality in women, and of course they're not comparable globally due to the different levels of population, but here we are with the very abrupt decrease in China in the first 2 decades, from 3.7 million to 400,000 to less than 500,000, and then remained low with some increase in the turn of the century and decrease afterwards, to levels, however, which are similar to those in the 1970s. Despite the population growth, which was in any case quite stable, since the population was quite stable since the turn of the century, and yet the levels have not decreased much. So the paradox in China is that the large reduction of the net burden of health inequity occurred mainly in the 60s and the 70s, while the GDP, let's call it explosion or huge growth, was by the turn of the century. And at that time, the net burden of health inequity does not increase. So there is a very clear dissociation between reduced net burden of health inequity and increased GDP above a certain level. China is a very, very strong, clear example. This is Nigeria with increasing levels, mainly due to its population growth and also high levels of relative burden of health inequity, as we will see later, followed by Pakistan, which overtook China, despite having a population now of less than 6 times that of China, and other countries like the Russian Federation with a huge increase in the 90s, where it was multiplied by more than 6 times the excess mortality in women, and then reduced but still around 300,000, followed by South Africa with a very similar increase due to AIDS in this case, with a more than doubling effect, in fact 4 times since the 90s, and still with 300,000 excess mortality. Indonesia, similar levels. DRC, similar levels. And then Mexico and other countries in the region of 100,000 like Brazil and others.